behavior that an individual utilizes to maximize productivity. So what are this knowledge? What is the skills? What are the technical skills? What are the soft skills that make productivity and maximize on productivity? So this is what we shall be looking at in this toolkit. And as a strategy for the implementation of competence, leadership development and training was identified as key to enhance competence. We need to train people so that we can enhance their competence. While you join the service, I think in Sierra Leone you must have come from a learning institution, a university. I don't know if at the entry level a degree is required or a master's level degree, but we shall also look at all these basic education platforms and how they feed into service delivery within government. How do you recruit? What level of competencies do you start with so that we can now enhance them going forward? So leadership development and training of public servants, and it's one of the strategies for the implementation of the SEPA principle. Next slide, please. So the leadership, the LDT PAM toolkit proposes a guide on the implementation and evaluation of leadership development and training in public administration. As mentioned earlier, it is aligned with Agenda 2063 and the SDGs. It further aims to strengthen the leadership capacity of public administrators for efficient and effective service delivery, which directly impacts sustainable development. Earlier in the week in my country, Kenya, we were attending a meeting where the ministry and the minister was launching a rapid transformation strategy which focused on 3 key items, which was SDP, to serve, to deliver, and to perform. So you can see from these countries, I see from Sierra Leone, you're talking about reform. My country, Kenya, we're talking about rapid transformation, and it almost seems like it's an evolution. You start at reform, and then you don't stop there. You keep reforming, and you keep making it better, and hence capacity building is important in that sense. So in the long-term objective of this toolkit is to transform and strengthen institutions to achieve their mandate of service delivery, as well as the realization of Agenda 2063 and the SDGs. In the African continent, we're talking about Agenda 2063 and the flagship programs that are underneath that umbrella, including the African Free Continental Trade Agreement, the Pan-African Payment Integration System, and to be able to effectively be part of these organizations, we need a competent public service that will not only think global, but act local as well. So when we're thinking maybe in the next 10 years, Sierra Leone will not be just serving the Sierra Leone public service, but the entire continent. And thus it is important to make sure that you have the right competencies so that you can be able to serve a continental public service. Thank you. The LTD platform will also serve as a guide for monitoring and reporting peer learning and exchange of public best practices. So as the custom of APRM, this will also serve as a toolkit for peer learning. We'll be able to learn from the Sierra Leonean experience. We'll be able to also compile what the Kenyan experience is, and not just to be able to give ranking, but to be able to learn across the board on what is working in Sierra Leone, what is working in another country, and enhance peer learning. Next slide, please. So as we were developing this toolkit, we were cognizant of the different realities in African countries. So we made some basic assumptions in the contextualization of this toolkit. And some of these assumptions are that African countries are at varying development stages on socio-economic and political dimensions. And this is a reality that we did not want to take for granted or balkanize African countries as one bloc, but concentrate on their individual realities. And this we brought out in this toolkit. And then we also made it very clear that competency is in a continuous state of flux. What we knew to be competency in the 1960s while we gained independence may not be relevant in the 21st century. So this will keep changing, and what we know as competence in this 21st century may not be relevant to the younger generation, the Gen X, Y, Z. So this is a constant flux which requires continuous learning and relearning of new competencies and new skills. So we want public service to be agile and to be responsive to these changes, to be acceptance of the changes and adapt to them. Among the other assumptions that we saw is that the leadership development and training is influenced by social, economic and social cultural factors. There are countries which have different cultural aspects, different economic status, and we wanted that to be completely captured within this toolkit. Then also we thought that competencies should be standardized across all levels of government. I think yesterday I was having a discussion with a gentleman and we were talking about how the local level local government here in Sierra Leone operates. But for this toolkit, we ought to standardize in terms of competencies. What is experienced at the local level should be the same level of service delivery that is experienced at the national level. Then finally, we also want to ensure that there's a positive correlation between leadership development, training, performance, and development. Once training has taken place, we want to ensure that the public servants can be able to perform, that this is a conducive environment for them to perform, and then ultimately contribute to the national development and continental development as a whole. Next slide, please. So in the course of development of this toolkit, we first started with a desk study and literature review. And as I mentioned yesterday, APAM produces a lot of research documents, including reports and journals. So our desk study review was mostly to do with what we have been doing in consultation with APRM, other authorities in terms of governance, including OECD, including ECOSOC, UNDESA, and other leading authorities in public administration. So we did a comprehensive literature review so as to come up with some basic indicators. Then the second stage we embarked on was a survey. We conducted a survey that really was almost like the baseline study conducted by APRM, where we wanted to understand where African governments were in terms of their leadership development plans, budgets, and what they consider to be competencies that their public administrators need. So from this survey, we were able to get about 12 responses from African countries, and we can talk about the response rate from African countries until the sun comes down, but I think that is one of the areas that we need to improve, that African governments need to respond to some of these surveys so that you can be included in either national planning or continental planning so that we can understand the various challenges that are experienced on a country level. But for this toolkit, we were able to receive 12 responses from African countries, which we think was really impressive, but hopefully next time we can have all 54 African countries responding to this survey so that we can have a very complete and comparative analysis. Then on the third stage, we did a data analysis so that we can just basically organize the data. And then we developed a draft toolkit. And then this toolkit was validated again in Kenya and in South Africa. And now we are in the stage of presentation of this toolkit to Sierra Leone, and the other African countries will adopt it as well. Next slide, please. So at this point, I would like to show you the toolkit itself. Play the PDF document now. The PDF document. Yes. So this is a part of the toolkit that we are now going to be presenting, and I just wanted us to quickly look at some of the criteria, the stakeholders, the indicators, and means of verification, and the guiding notes. Yesterday, Sarah and the APRM team gave a QR code that we hope that the government and various stakeholders in Sierra Leone will be able to share their responses on, but I'd just like to show you in a bit how the toolkit itself looks like. So the critical area that we started with, and we thought that was the first point in terms of policy development, was to analyze the policy, legal, and institutional framework. And this was in relation to providing an enabling environment for leadership development training, and of course to assess the political will and commitment at national and local level. Going by the example of Sierra Leone in having this multi-stakeholder engagement, and of course having the minister and at the highest level, the chief minister also being part of this program, and the presidential agenda with the big five agenda, and big four being on revamping the public service, I can say that in terms of political will and commitment at the highest level, that Sierra Leone is doing quite well on that. So within that area, the stakeholders, The stakeholders are at government level, executive, national, local government level. I think what I learned from the minister yesterday is the inclusion of the members of parliament. I think that is perhaps something that, in terms of talking about the political administrative nexus, perhaps we haven't brought it quite clearly here, but I think we may need to include the members of parliament onto this toolkit, so that is noted from our side. And then in terms of an indicator, what we wanted to evaluate is this enshrined in your constitution? Is this aligned to national development? And of course, is the country a member of APRM? So I can attest again that this is aligned to your national development plan. It has been a presidential declaration and a decree to ensure that the public service functions optimally. So we can say that those indicators, without looking at the actual statistics and data, we can infer that this is evident, and some of those indicators listed therein. And in terms of means of verification, of course, we will go into the Constitution and look at the Constitution of, I think I had Constitution of 1991, if I'm not wrong. The current Constitution is from 1991, if I'm wrong, please make sure to correct me. And then we also want to see if the country has ratified the African Charter on Values and Principles of Public Service, and that is an instrument that has been ratified, and of course it has been implemented. And then of course we wanted to ensure that there is a National School of Administration, National School of Government that continuously provides learning and development at the national level and also at the local level. And then just going further down, without taking too much time, we also wanted to look at the financial and budgetary allocation and awareness as an indicator. And the stakeholders therein were the executive or policymakers, again, the policy implementation. And this, one of the topics was very interesting for us to see, and this was in terms of the finance. And I think yesterday we had representatives from the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning. So how much of the national budget is apportioned to capacity building and training of public administrators? How often is this training budget reviewed? Is it a responsive budgeting process that now caters for the needs, changing needs of public service? I think during COVID, all budgets were aligned towards disaster and pandemic, dealing with that. Have we now recovered from the pandemic and this post-COVID economic environment? How is the budget aligned to empowering the public service? And then to what extent do austerity measures impact this budget? When we set the budget and then austerity measures come, we have to switch things out in the budget. Has this affected training, or do we maintain the same budget for leadership capacity building? I think one of the most profound things I heard from one of the training programs is that when donor funds or international development countries, they don't ask you what you think is important in your country, what you value most. They just ask you to give them your budgets and your balance sheets, and from them they can infer what is most important to you. If you allocate 90 or 80% of your budget towards one thing, in most cases it's recurrent cost in terms of payments and whatnot, and then in others it is in terms of warfare, as we have seen in the United States and other developed countries. So your budget is indicative of where your government places most importance. So that is also an indication that we wanted to look at. And then further down, we will look at the design and the delivery of training programs. And at this level, we're looking at curriculum development. So as mentioned, this toolkit seeks to standardize the practice and excellence of public administration. So when we talk about what is a practice that is in Sierra Leone, this needs to be standardized in Kenya, in Uganda, in Morocco, from Cape to Cairo. It needs to be standardized in all African governments. So these stakeholders in this is the MDIs, the schools of government, who do the design and the delivery of curriculum. What are they putting in the curriculum? Are they mainstreaming the SDGs within the curriculum? Is this aligned to the national development? What is the role of universities, professional organizations, national and continental organizations such as APAM? What level of engagement do we have with these agencies? And then of course from this we want to see the academic and administrative nexus and the alignment to the strategic needs of the country. Then we also want to see if there's a professional organization within the country are administrators part of an organizational body which continuously monitors their performance, which continuously comes up with programs relevant to their needs? Do they get awarded career development points? So in a snapshot, that is what the toolkit sort of looks at. We can go back to the PowerPoint presentation, please. Number two? Yes, that one. No, up. No, up a little bit. No, not this one, the PowerPoint. Yes, close that one. Yes, number 2. Yes, that one. Oh. Yes, number 1. So as you find it, so who can use this toolkit? As we said, this is a very comprehensive toolkit where we want everyone to be able to use it. All stakeholders are considered in the utilization of this toolkit. So at the government level, at MDACs, we call them ministries, departments, agencies, and counties or local government for this matter. And then we're also including the MDIs, Schools of Public Administration. And at the heart of this toolkit is the public administrators, yourselves as government, the engine of government service. You're the ones who actually embark on these training programs. You're the ones who get analyzed in terms of performance based on your specific training, based on your competencies. So you as public administrators are at the heart of this toolkit. Next slide, please. So in terms of strategic, we are on slide 12. Slide 12. Slide 12. Next. Yes, next. Yes. This is the strategic importance of the toolkit. So as mentioned, we want to encourage the harmonization of policies and procedures related to leadership development so that we can be able to effectively implement the African Continental Development Goals. It also provides an elaborative and inclusive strategy for leadership development and training of public servants. And then, of course, finally, I'll just talk about the anchoring leadership development and capacity building framework as a basic tenet for the actualization of development aspirations of Agenda 2063 and Agenda 20 and the SDGs. So I think in an essence, what we want to do with this toolkit is to ensure that there are values. I think when throughout the time we have been here in Sierra Leone, it has been relatively clear on what the nation considers to be their national value system, and we think that is something that is quite important. Another aspect that is also going to come out within this toolkit is how to do succession management and training of young professionals. And then amongst the skills and competencies that we want to ensure that they are mainstreamed in government is on digital transformation and adopting of new technologies. And then, of course, as emerging issues, we also want to place importance on mental health issues. I think coming from COVID time, we have experienced an upsurge of mental issues where people are going through a lot mentally, and we're not trying to just see public servants as vehicles, as machines, but as a whole person, and talk about them in a holistic way. Make sure that they're emotionally at peace, make sure that they're physically at peace, and make sure that they can be able to perform optimally. Then, of course, as a new emerging issue, we want to also focus on climate action, the effects of climate change on the continent, and how this affects productivity in the public service, and of course, natural resource management. I think for the longest time we've heard about Sierra Leone, it has been synonymous with diamonds, so those are some of the emerging areas that we would like this toolkit to also look at. So we wish you all the best as we leave you with this toolkit. It is our honest belief that through this toolkit you will be able to serve and serve with honor. I thank you so much and wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Julie. Can we give her another round of applause? So, Julie just has presented the toolkit for the competency development as it relates to leadership as part of the strategies and guidelines for enhancing policy environment for implementing the Agenda 2063. I think we are very much interested in this toolkit, given that we also developed a competency framework in the Sierra Leone Civil Service. And this is very timely, because as you rightly said, this is going to be a standardized methodology across Africa on how we can strengthen leadership for us to be able to deliver on the SDGs and the Agenda 2063. So I want to thank you so much for that presentation, and I think we'll have to share insights on this and also, get some technical advice from you on how we can tailor our own competency framework to be able to accommodate APAM toolkit. Thank you so much. Okay, so without much ado, I think we must proceed. We have the last speaker for this session, who is Dr. Enoch Tunoburo. Dr. Tunoburo, let me invite you to take the podium. Thank you so much. You're welcome.
Good morning. I think after the ladies have spoken, my work is very easy. And as the presentation comes on, I come from the SDG Center for Africa. I bring you greetings from Kigali, which is a city of 1,000 hills. The Sustainable Development Goals Center was constituted at the UN General Assembly in 2015, while the Sustainable Development Goals were being adopted. And at that time, the motivation behind that was that Africa lagged behind all the other regions in terms of development agenda. So there was need to accelerate sustainable development goals. And at the time, the African leaders were challenged to have an institution that would accelerate the implementation of SDGs. The incoming chair at the time was President Paul Kagame, who opted to host the center in Kigali, and we've since made mileage with the regional center in Lusaka, and we have 9 African presidents on the board. What I'm supposed to talk through is about sustainable development goals. As you know, sustainable development goals are about 17 goals, but they cover 3 main areas. One is that there has to be growth, but growth must be inclusive, which is now the social inclusion. And thirdly is that the environment must be protected. So those are the 3 key elements of sustainable development goals. They are also reflected in what we call the 5 pillars. The first pillar is the people, which reflects the social inclusion. The second pillar is the planet, which reflects the environment. But there must be prosperity. It's not just about people, the people must prosper. So there has to be prosperity. But for prosperity to happen, there has to be peace. And as you know, Africa is increasingly becoming fragile. So peace is a core element. And of course, the last is that to deliver all these, you must have partnership. Now, I think the theme today is about the civil service reform and where it's rooted. But when these SDGs were adopted, at the core of the SDGs was who's the main custodian of these sustainable development goals. The main custodian is government. And whose government is basically about the civil service. And what we have seen, and I think what Julie was saying, is that leadership development is positively correlated with development. And essentially that's what the main custodian being government. It is in terms of getting this template of sustainable development goals and customizing it to the local context. What is best fit for Sierra Leone, for example. These SDGs must be mainstreamed through the National Development Plan. They must be aligned, the budgets must be aligned. There has to be a clear monitoring framework. There has to be accountability. Many actually institutions have parliamentary bodies or committees of monitoring these sustainable development goals. The last time we did a survey, we actually noticed that in almost 97% of the African countries, there is an SDG coordination committee. But what we've seen, and some of the weaknesses we've seen, is that at the high level, there's buy-in. If you look at the level of awareness in terms of sustainable development goals, cascading down to the different levels of implementation, you find that the awareness levels tend to dwindle when you go to beyond the Ministry of Finance and probably the statistical offices. These sustainable development goals are not well known. But where is the civil service? In which goal do you find civil service deeply rooted? As you know, Goal 16 talks about peace and strong institutions. So Sustainable Development Goal 16 is where you'll find strong emphasis on the civil service reform. And when we do a broader correlation between good governance and sustainable development goals, we still see a positive correlation. Countries with poor scores on governance actually have low scores in terms of sustainable development goals. If you do it, respective of which governance index you use and the sustainable development goal index, you find that, and I'm happy to note that for Sierra Leone, it's not in the bottom performance, it's on average. On both of them, it's above 50% in terms of advance towards the attainment of the goals, but also in terms of the governance framework. Now, I think the presentation didn't come through, but one of the things that also we see that is critical, and I think it has come through emphasis of the CIPA principles. Civil service must be accountable, it must be transparent, but it also must be inclusive. As we know about sustainable development goals, we are saying leave no one behind. So if you're going to lead, you must embed a bottoms-up approach and also a top-down approach. So the narrative that is being used is a whole government approach and a whole society approach. And I think the theme of multi-stakeholder engagement is quite critical. In many governments, including my country, Uganda, we do have a multi-stakeholder SDG coordination committee. There's a separate SDG coordination unit that, so you have a political committee, then you have a technical committee, and these frequently meet and ensure that there is coordination with the planning cycle. So that is important to have, I think, a multi-stakeholder coordination committee. The other aspect, and I think lessons that we see across several countries, and Sarah touched on it in her presentation, we cannot go away with the e-governance. E-governance will help us to monitor, it will help us to understand and also improve efficiency. And when I look at, we did a study on Rwanda, and Rwanda has scaled in terms of e-governance. It has an integrated platform where it embeds, it has 104 government services on one platform. So if you need anything, if you're arriving, for example, during COVID, all your applications, passport and everything would be submitted. Before you arrive, you'd find you're cleared and everything. If you're applying for a movement permit during COVID, you do it clearly on the system. If you need a passport, everything is done on the system, and seamlessly you'd have these activities undertaken. So the other, I think, elements that I had wanted to show, they were more visual in terms of how Sierra Leone is performing in terms of the good governance aspirations, both in the AU 2063 as well as the SDG index. The performance broadly is that we are we are performing moderately. There is need to scale, and the political buy-in and Sarah, I think this won't show, but I think I can proceed. The other aspects of effective civil service reform, I think Sarah also talked about it. She spoke about subsidiarity, and there are several elements where decentralized service, when you decentralize, it's not just, you must ensure that they are also empowered, not just to create subnational units, but without the tools of operationalization. The other key aspect in civil service that is quite critical, there must be sanctions, there must also be incentives. And these must be based on performance-based contracting. If you want to avoid, and this we've seen also when we look at public and private partnerships. The private sector will tell you there will not be a substitute when you have a weak public service. The public, and even where we have seen weak public service, public-private partnerships have not worked. They actually increase costs on government. So it is essential that a strong and capable public service is in place. And I think the elements have also been coming through, both through Julie and Sarah, that training is essential. But also you should notice that we are living in a very fast-moving, and so we must cater in our resource management strategy elements of adaptability. As we go also with AI, are we ready to embed these in our delivery mechanisms? So that's the other aspect that we see, and I think the APAM works with a number of public administration entities across Africa, where they coordinate and provide lesson learning in terms of civil service public administration. The other aspect is, and without, many times we will say there is a resource constraint, but there's a lot of institutions that want to offer this technical capacity, and we should go away from the traditional way of getting technical assistance, where someone comes as an expert, sits in the ministry, does the work, and then goes away. In the end, here they haven't imparted. So we must learn from these experts where they've come through, so that then they have imparted skills. And I've seen this in a number of countries which I won't mention. A number of experts from Kenya and Uganda used to work in some neighboring countries. When they were able to train and have, so maybe you could go one slide. So this shows and this shows Sierra Leone's performance, particularly on African Union 2063 goals. There are 20 goals, but the focus is more on the goals which relate to governance and more related to institutions. On 12 and 13, the data wasn't there, so that's why the score is 0. But when it came to democratic values there, the score was a bit red. And this is done by NEPAD and African Union in terms of the assessment. Then I think we could go, let's just 2 slides before. No, so this is extracted from an Africa SDG index and dashboard. It shows to what extent are we performing against SDG 16. And if you look at it's dominantly red across the board, apart from, but red means that there are sizable challenges that, that countries are facing in terms of good governance, or SDG 16. And in terms of the trend, how far we are towards meeting the 2030 goals. As you know, we are now midway. towards the implementation of SDGs. But for Sierra Leone, we see that yes, we have major challenges, and because of that, we are also stagnating in terms of progress towards meeting these goals. We could look at sub-indicators, which is the next slide. In terms of sub-indicators, and they are defined here in terms of homicides, in terms of detainees as unsentenced detainees. We have under 5 birth registration. We have safe walking. I think here it should be, Sierra Leone should score highly, because last night I was able to walk, and then expropriations, then the corruption. So I think Sierra Leone is, where do I see it? Somewhere. Yeah. So it's only on a few aspects. I think corruption still remains a red. This is according to the corruption index. And then there's another red, but we have a green in terms of weaponry. And this, you'll see that Africa is predominantly green because we don't necessarily export weapons. So the red is really on corruption. The other aspects, I think we could go to the next slide in the interest of time. The next one, we had seen this. In terms of what we see, and this draws from a report we worked on with APRM, it's not all, the legal foundation and policy framework is in place in terms of good governance here in Sierra Leone. Judy had said 1991, the Constitution is 1991. Which provides for human rights and freedom of individuals. There's an Anti-Corruption Act, there's a national strategy for investigation of corruption. There's an establishment of right of access to information, and then there's an enactment of right of access to the Act. So broadly, the legal framework is in place. And I think some of the APRM reviews that we see, the main finding is that these policy frameworks are in place, but the enforcement is where now the civil service can actually play a scaling role to ensure, because the moment you don't have effective enforcement, then the documents, the laws they don't become active laws. So it's important that this can be scaled on. I think the next slide. So I was talking about principles, and I'd referred to really a number of all these. Merit-based recruitment, good case studies from Botswana there. Customer-centric approach, where you embed just beyond the whole government approach, but now you're taking a whole society approach. So you're taking a citizen-based. South Africa offers a Batho Pele people first approach in its development strategy. So this essentially gives some of the primary principles of effective civil service. The list is not exhaustive. There are certainly many that can be scalable. So I think I would stop here. My language, we say if you want to keep people interested, just have to keep it as short as a miniskirt, but it should be long enough to cover the subject matter, and I think I have done that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gino. Let us give him another round of applause. He actually emphasized on the SDGs and the Agenda 2023, and then what is supposed to be our role in public service, particularly in creating strong institutions. And I think in the dashboard, he did reveal that we have been performing very moderately. Actually enacted some laws, but again, he cautioned that enforcement of those laws are important for us to be able to score better And of course, the area of sanctions and incentives for performance management was also highlighted, because there's no way performance management can be effective if we do not enforce the sanctions and incentives. Thank you so much, I think, for all our three speakers. They've done justice to this topic, and I think it's now time for us to get reactions, questions, and contributions from the audience, which speakers will have the opportunity to also respond and maybe explain those areas that are not being properly understood. So I would entertain at least five interventions. For the sake of time, I will entertain 5 interventions from the audience. Can we start with this end? Any questions, comments? Somebody, did I see a hand up? Okay, I've seen one hand. And then where? Okay, the lady there. Okay, another gentleman over here, and then got 3. Is that right? Okay, I think we'll start with the gentleman in the middle here. Please make your interventions very brief and to the point, and let's avoid preambles, long preambles. Please state your name and the organization you are representing, so that we know exactly who is talking.
Thank you very much. My name is Charles Lahai, and I work for the Independent Commission for Peace and National Cohesion. I'm referring to presentations that were made yesterday and that have also flown into today's presentation. What I want to know is the clear dichotomy between public service and civil service. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dichotomy between public service and civil service, okay? Next, the lady in the middle.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Madam Hilary John from the National Council for Civic Education and Development. Well, Charles actually asked the first question I also wanted to ask, but just a few comments now. Revamping or reforming the civil service is not new. We know that the documents, PRSP, Agenda for Change, Agenda for Prosperity, Attitudinal Change, etc., all had instances where we have to revamp the civil service. But yes, still we are here talking about revamping the civil service. I hope after this well-attended session, we'll go down and see with the political will, we can start somewhere or continue where we have been. And somebody yesterday, I can't remember, one of our visitors or minister spoke about the mindset. And I think that is the one reason or the one thing all of us should take away from it. If we set our minds that, yes, we are going to revamp the civil service, we'll get there. Another person talked about discipline, which I think is the one thing responsible for the lapses we have in the civil service. The chief minister made a joke of it, saying some issues can be dealt with over tea break or passing the sugar over. So let's look at that area to be disciplined in handling these things. Institutions and laws. All the last speaker from Rwanda just said that there are laws and institutions, but they are not being implemented. So we have to look at those areas as well. Lastly, yesterday, all of us, or some of us, agree that the civil service is bloated. Yes, it is in a way. But can we also remember that government is one big employer in our country? The private sector is not much. So if we are going to scale down, perhaps we can also think of enforcing the private sector by asking investors to come so they can take over employment from the government. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I think let them finish and then you respond. Let's have the third intervention. Will not end, yes.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Suleiman Jallo, I'm a journalist and I write for Export Times newspaper and magazine. Madam Sarah spoke about advocacy and assessment of SEPA principles in Africa for effective implementation of SDGs Agenda 2063. My attention has been drawn to bullet point number 2, which is accountability, and that talks about integrity, transparency, and independent oversight. And then it is quite clear that in Africa, or most African countries, depends on donor partners. How can this be achieved? Or how can Africans provide independent oversight to their governance system, wherein such mindset are still in our leaders still have this mindset? And secondly, you reiterated from the minister's statement yesterday. He said, after the Civil War, the capacity building of Sierra Leone was eroded away, of which he just stated here this morning. And you said you will be providing or Sierra needs capacity building on the principles of governance in recruiting those people that will be capacitated. And then just of recent, where we had, I must comment, the Independent Commission for Peace and National Cohesion. Over the years, Sierra Leone had a political impasse, if I can say, where if I benefited and I'm supporting political X, if you capacitated me and a political Y is in power, I will not become forward to deliver service. As a partner to the government of Sierra Leone, how will you go about in selecting those beneficiaries? At least they can provide governance policies within the public sector. Thank you.
Please, the last speaker, the journalist, I think one of the speakers, Sarah, is asking that you repeat the last question. I think she didn't get it clearly.
Okay, as a partner to the government of Sierra Leone, how would you go about in selecting the right people or beneficiaries to capacitate them in order to contribute immensely to the public service sector?
We're going to select those that are, whose capacities are going to be built. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
At least they can contribute immensely to the public service.
Okay, that's okay. Yes, Minister? I saw your hand up. Okay.
Okay, I think let the panelists respond, then I will do the wrap-up. Because some questions are direct.
Okay. Do you have any more? Yes, I think I can see one hand. Yes, sir. Please state your name and the organization you're representing.
Thank you very much. I am Mohamed Bikoma from civil society. I only have one public question or a comment. Our concern as civil society is what our role in revamping the public sector, the whole of civil society, in all of this discourse. Because from the agenda we saw, we're partners in this, but we don't know what our role is. Thank you.
Okay. So what's the role of the civil society in revamping the public sector? Is that right? Okay. Yes, can we have the last?
Yeah, thank you, sir. My name is Sir Lami Kotegui, the Executive Secretary for the National Commission for Persons with Disability. My concern is the inclusion, especially inclusion of persons with disability. As we speak within the public sector, we have very or no people with disability within our public sector. How do we ensure, with the principles of leaving no one behind, that the issue of disability, like gender, is mainstream within all of our programs, and what we talk in terms of building capacity, in terms of making sure employability of people with disability within the civil service and other public sector is scaled up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So can we get the presenters to now respond? Who wants to start? Okay, Sarah.
Just to get it clearly, the first question was the dichotomy between the civil servant and public servant. There was a question on accountability. A third question on how we engage beneficiaries to be part of SEPA principles. The third question on the role of civil society and in promoting the revamping of civil service reforms. And last but not least, how people with disabilities can improve the policies or the conditions for them in civil service. I will focus mainly on the question regarding civil service and public service. So the civil servant, by definition, is the bureaucrat which is hired by the government to work for the public sector, including all of you, including those who are hired under specific processes, exams, interviews to get into the civil service. This is the civil servant. The public servant, on the other hand, is usually elected or appointed member of the government for social or public services. For instance, I will give an example from Egypt. We have the civil service, the government. When I joined the government as civil servant in 2008, 2009, I was committed to deliver on specific tasks every day. But we have another system in Egypt called public service. Once we graduate from the faculty, from the undergraduate school, we must spend 1 year public service in any public institution. I graduated from the faculty of economics and political science, but the government will direct me to support Cairo University for 1 year for public service. And usually, you are not supposed to be paid too much for this public service. However, it's a chance for you to understand the dynamic of the government and how the government functions. And maybe after that, you will be promoted for a civil service job. So I hope the question, so what I would want to say that each civil servant should be public servant in essence in order to respond to his duties or her duties in a professional manner. So it's something you do for the country and you don't expect return. It's something like the voluntary service that you can do for people with disabilities, for community development, and this is a very, very important component of civil service in general. I think I will leave my colleagues to reflect on the other questions regarding accountability measures or beneficiaries. I was just presenting quickly, but there are many beneficiaries should be benefit from SEPA principles, not just the government. Actually, civil society is very important to hold the government accountable, especially the national CSOs. But I will leave the other 3 questions to my colleagues, and if I have something else, I will add at the end. Thank you. Madam.
Thank you. Yes, I think we are aligned in the definition of public service and civil service. Often they're used interchangeably, like in my country, it's public service. I've seen in other African countries the public service being referred to as the civil service. So those dichotomies, as the minister was saying, shouldn't be public service or civil service. It is all of us playing a role in government. So we agree on that. So in terms of advocacy of SDGs and selecting participants for capacity building programs, I think that is how the participant phrased the question. So for us as an organization, APAM, we work mostly with the government, so from the Ministry of Public Service, and they would be able to maybe point out the actors or the stakeholders that are relevant in terms of capacity building. However, we do encourage the inclusion of the civil service organizations, the media, and other stakeholders to be part of this conversation because it is a whole of government sort of approach in terms of implementation and even coordination of the SDGs and Agenda 2063. So I think that is to do with that. In terms of accountability, we are going to be having the next session primarily on accountability. So let's just hang on for that question for the next session. I think it will be covered within that next topic that we will be coming from. And then, of course, inclusivity as, again, another principle, ensuring that people with disabilities, mainstreaming gender. I think in the toolkits that you will see, the one that we have presented, we are talking about gender-responsive budgeting and ensuring that we have a conducive environment for learning for all public administrators, including those with disabilities. So I think that is well spoken to within the toolkits that we have developed. So again, we insist on the whole of government approach in terms of what is your individual role as a public servant, as a public administrator, in ensuring the implementation of the SDGs. So a whole of government, whole of society approach. What can you be able to participate in your level in terms of delivering service in your desk as a customer service agent? How can you ensure that you operate in a professional? How can you ensure that you operate in a way with integrity? And that, I think, can be your individual participation within that. Thank you.
I think the ladies have answered. I will speak to maybe one, because I love women, so the gender issue will speak to me. The one is, as we know, within the SDG, SDG 5 is actually about gender empowerment. But across all SDGs, there's a promotion of collecting data from a disaggregated. So one of the disaggregated elements that I included there is gender. So in all the data that we collect, if we have to plan for gender, we actually need to collect data. But SDG 5 in particular looks at the representation both from political but also at administrative units. This is information that should be collected in terms of public office holding by gender. So I think this is something also that could, with data, help in mainstreaming and also monitoring the level of progress. But the other mechanism that we see that scales is essentially about about gender-based budgeting. In a number of countries, through the budget process, they have, I know in one of the countries they have an Equal Opportunities Commission, which issues gender budget compliance certificates every time the budget is issued. It issues it at planning process, but also looks at the implementation process to ensure that the budget that are proposed are actually gender inclusive. So those are some of the mechanisms I think that should be, but any civil service strategy should actually have a gender lens. And such a commission, if it's an Equal Opportunities Commission, should be able to internalize and ensure that at planning stage, because if you miss that, then you're not able to implement and monitor it. So that's, I think, the point that gender comes in. Thank you.
Okay, so these are the responses from the speakers. I just wanted to add my voice to the first question about the dichotomy between the public service and the civil service. The responses I got, I think, seems to be contextual. You can see that in every country, they have their own way of looking at it. Kenya, they use this interchangeably. Egypt, they said that their public services are services that you render after school as voluntary, it's not being paid. But again, in our context, it's actually different. Public service in the Sierra Leone context is service in respect of the government of Sierra Leone. It involves persons that are paid from the Consolidated Revenue Fund or those agencies that are set up by acts of parliament. Whilst the civil service is a core of the public service, it involves people that formulate policies and who are governed by the Civil Service Code and the Public Service Commission regulations. So civil servants in our context are actually part of the public service. So all civil servants are public servants, but not all public servants are civil servants. I think that's a very succinct way of putting it. I thought I should just clarify it in our context, in Sierra Leone context. I think the minister also wanted to make some intervention. So let us please listen to Minister Amara Kalon to give his own insights on this all-important topic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Ansu Toka, Director General of the HRM. Yeah, maybe I just want to lend my voice to some of the issues that came up from the questions and answer sessions. Somebody was asking, many reforms have been undertaken, and still we are talking about reform. What we need to understand that reforms is not an event or a process. And the world is getting dynamic. Things are changing every day. We have emerging issues, the issue of technology, the issue of gender, the issue of disability, as our brother was saying, the issue of the geopolitics playing in different countries, the spate of operational change of government across Africa, the causes and effects. All of those are emerging issues that makes it incumbent on us to continue reforms as and when needed. So it's not an event, it's a process. We started it, you had yesterday from South Africa. Their public service was hinged initially from the colonial master. Then they changed. Then they have the apartheid system. They factored their public service system into the apartheid system. Then they have to change because they have the apartheid behind their backs. And they are now looking at a different scenario. So it changes over time. So even after this, we are going to continue to have public service reforms. So we need to be clear on this so that we don't think that Amara Kalon and the ministry are going to do this, once and for all. In terms of the bloated civil service or the bloated public service, I think that's one of the reasons for the reforms. We all know, and yesterday it was clear and it's evident across, in Sierra Leone. You see a lot of commissions, agencies, they are threatening the very existence of our ministries. They are a threat to our very ministries. To the civil servants, they are a threat to these agencies because they have usurped the powers, authorities, responsibilities of the civil service. And that has created jealousy. That has created demotivation for the civil service, who has the sole and the legal responsibility to deliver on government's, development agendas. So what we are saying, let's look at how we can shrink those institutions. Let's harmonize them, rationalize them. What we are doing today is just to lay the framework, is to lay the foundation. We are doing the assessment. After this conference, we are going to sit. We're going to set different committees looking at how do we create a lean. Even the names, the identity, the nomenclatures we have for the head of these institutions. Some call themselves CEO, some call themselves Director General, some call themselves Director. There are all names for all the agencies and commissions in this country. And each of those nomenclature have their different job description and have their different salaries. So why can't we harmonize the name and have one name? If we say all commission, they're all directors, we say they're all directors. So it makes it easy for even the Wage and Compensation Commission to do sectoral gradings. So we know all directors are under the same grade. Rather than having a CEO, you have to look what is the CEO's grading system, the Director General's grading system, the Program Manager's grading system. So these are the things we'll be looking at as we move on. The recruitment process, that's why we're here. We're all going to agree. PSC, the Article 152 is challenged presently because we have lots of commissions now that are doing recruitment across the board without paying any dividend to the PSC. Are we going to strengthen the Public Service Commission, strengthen its capacity, expand on it so that they can be able to do their legal responsibility, so that let the Commission focus on their corporate responsibility and allow the PSC to do recruitment? Are we going to centralize recruitment so that we can follow up and know who are in the civil and the public service? These are questions we should be asking ourselves now moving forward. The reorientation of the mindset, yes, this was one of my flagship, team when I came in 2018 as the Deputy Minister of Political and Public Affairs. And I spoke one time with His Excellency the President. I told him, Mr. President, do all you want to do. Build all the hospitals, build all the schools, construct all the roads, fix the water. At night, they will go and cut the pipes. They will steal the medicines. They will dig the roads. They will steal the books for the schools. Teachers will not go to school because it's a mindset. It's a matter of mindset. We have institutionalized corruptions. People don't know that the pipes that government buys for water are the taxpayers' money. Your uncle is working for the government of Sierra Leone. 35% of his salary goes for pay as you earn. That's the tax money being used. Your mother selling at the market, pay the Jolt tickets, 1,000. That money from that chiefdom goes to the national coffer, and that's the money being used to pay other people to build the hospitals and the roads. Have we been able to raise awareness that anything you do, the medicines you steal, you are stealing your own money as a nurse in the hospital. You are stealing your own tax money, selling it cheaply, so you are going to have a heavy burden on your own payee. If you continue doing that, the role of the CSO, that's why you are here, and that's why we brought you here. And there is a whole session on CSOs. So you will hear on accountability and transparency. That's your own role. So you are not left behind, you will be part of it. Inclusiveness, that's one of the SEPA principles. Inclusiveness. That's why yesterday I presented, I said, one of the issues that is sort of bringing about the reform is the emergence of gender, the emergence of youth bulge, the emergence of disabilities, and the emergence of the fifth region, the sixth region of Africa, which is the diasporans. We have a huge deposit of diaspora knowledge and experience across the globe, which we have not tapped into. How can we tap into? That's why we have Professor Ezra Haroni here. He will be speaking during that session from the United States of America, representing the Center for Global Africa, a diaspora institution, to look how we can tap into those knowledge and experience at the diaspora level for us to continue this public service reform. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can we get the views of the Chairman PSC, please? Lastly, as a last intervention.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I just wanted to crystallize one or two areas. One that is touching on the private sector's relationship with the public sector. Until the economy was liberalized, there was a thin line between the private and public sector in this country. But with the advent of liberalization, governments government cannot do business. Business should be left in the hands of the public sector or private sector. But our own private sector has not been too active. That is why, in the wisdom of the president of late, he's talking about partnering with the public sector. You hear about the Koya zone, where a lot of industries are beginning to spring forward. It's only the private sector that can create wealth, employment, and other things. Whereas in our circumstance, the whole body of employment has been resting on government. And even in the area, the DG touched seriously on our own situation as it is, the difference between the private and public sector. Generally speaking, all workers can be termed as public sector, but the civil service is just a small sector in the public sector. And they are those who are involved in bureaucracy, the small group of people that are kind of like instruments of government who propagate and implement government policy, mostly within the bureaucratic setting. Our security forces, teachers and others, all of these people, even the parastatals, these are public servants. So for us to understand better, that is the dichotomy. In the area of public sector, let us not confuse ourselves. This is a liberalized economy, but our private sector is not that developed compared to other countries. That is why the area of job creation, wealth, and other things is still being overburdened by governments. But we see industries springing up today. These are the people who are supposed to create wealth, employment, and other things. Government is not their business entity. Or we've been forced to circumstances where our payroll has been bloated because government is obliged to provide livelihood for its people. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Kilbar, for that intervention. Also, the minister's intervention also mentioned about the proliferation of agencies. I think if I have to comment on that, I would say the impetus for creating agencies have been really driven by the poor remuneration in the civil service, that I would say. Most agencies, yes, in some cases, they are justified to have been created, but in some cases, it's because of the poor remuneration of the civil service. And normally, agencies that have been created earn more salaries than the regular civil service, which is supposed to supervise those agencies. So that's where I think we've gone wrong. So you find out that most divisions or units under ministries now want to break up to become agencies because they have better salaries, they have better conditions of service. I think this is an area we have to look into. That's why the establishment of the Wages and Compensation Commission is very, very critical, because we cannot just make pay as a driving force. There has to be an absolute need for an agency to be independent, for it to run as an independent agency, rather than just creating it because of we want to have conditions that are better in the civil service. So this has actually left the civil service kind of moribund and in a state that is not attractive to most people. Okay, so again, coming back to the subject, I want you all to join me in thanking our speakers. They have been quite insightful in actually bringing out the issues of the SEPA principles and how we can build the capacity of our public service to be able to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2063. So I want to thank you very much, and I want us to give them a last round of applause for the brilliant. You want to wrap up? Okay. So this is where my own role is going to end as the facilitator or moderator for this particular session, and I will hand you over to the organizer, Dr. Gaima.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ansitoka. Now, a round of applause for Mr. Ansitoka as the moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday at some point I did say the momentum is building. Here we are, since 1991, compatriots still want to have a distinction between the public service and the civil service. Here we are, since return to multi-party democracy, we are arguing whether we have too big a government or too small a government. Whether there should be agencies, departments, or there should be ministries. So His Excellency is justified that we must look again at our public service. So Mr. Minister, your job is cut out for you, because we need to answer these questions. The interesting thing is that the national constitution that is envisaged, whose overarching principle will be to strengthen and deepen our democratic institutions of state, will include a chapter on the public service. Sierra Leone's public service will be defined. The structure of Sierra Leone's public service will be defined. The functions, the relationships, the functional relationships and interrelationships will be defined, and the features will be defined. So hopefully going forward, advancing the process of the reform, and indeed revamping it, we will not be answering such questions a couple of months going forward. Thank you very much, Mr. Toplan and panel. Ladies and gentlemen, it now gives me the pleasure to call in for the next session, Accountability, Core Strategies and Best Practices. We are looking at Good Governance Africa. And our moderator is going to be Ms. Julie Mutanga. Julie, please.
Thank you so much, sir. I'm glad to put down my speaker hat and put on my moderator hat for this session on accountability, core strategies and best practices, good governance in Africa. So as we started off the first session, we were talking about the first group in the SEPA principles, which is on effectiveness. And now we're moving into the second group, which is on accountability. And to help us discuss this topic, it is my pleasure to invite Mr. William Carew, the head of Secretariat for the Economic, Social and Cultural Council, African Union, that is ECOSOC. Sir, you're welcome. Please give him an applause as he comes. Our second presenter is Mr. Andrew Laville, the Director for the Institute of Governance Reforms. Sir, you're welcome. And finally, Mr. Charles Lahai, the Independent Commission for Peace and National Cohesion. You're welcome, sir. Just to speak on the gender balance, I think our lady presenter is unfortunately unable to join, Miss Beauty Nata, but I'm sure the gentleman will do this topic justice. So within this topic, we're looking at practices for enhancing accountability in Africa. And just by way of mentioning, the principles that are attached to accountability is integrity, transparency, independent oversight. And within this topic now we shall explore the thorny issues of corruption and anti-corruption practices and how to enhance transparency. When we're talking about accountability, who are we accountable to? We're accountable to the citizens. So it is my pleasure to welcome this esteemed panel to discuss this topic. Mr. William Carew, you may have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Julie. Let me start by recognizing the honorable ministers, senior government officials, members of the senior officials from the APRM Secretariat, the African Union, international organizations and partners that are present, civil society, organization, members of parliament, all protocol observed. I think this is a very important discourse, and I want to start by indicating that maybe the perspective that I'm going to share will provide a bit of response together with my fellow panelists in responding to the question of the role of civil society in this particular process. I am very glad to be here today in my capacity as the head of Secretariat for the African Union Economic, Social and Cultural Council, which is an advisory organ of the African Union established to give African civil society a voice in the development agenda of the continent. And in this regard, at the very outset, we need to acknowledge the fact that this conversation is very important, and that the relationship between government and civic association are far more complex than presumed. And in fact, that is the reason why we want to see an inclusive process where everybody is involved and we're able to discuss as a collective. In the development discourse, it is being argued that civil society provides a third leg in the Trinity model of development. The state-led public sector model has been called as the first sector, the state. The private sector model for economic development and for profit enterprises as the second sector. And more fundamentally, the civil society as the third sector of non-profit associational life. Civil society can be seen as the sum total of individual and collective initiatives for common public good. The potential of civil society in affecting the state and citizens' life is beginning to be recognized all over the African continent. You will agree with me that there is that unstructured working relationship between government and civil society. And many a time, civil society, from one hand, is seen as an opposition to government. But at the same time, there are civil society who only opposes government. They never compliment even when government is doing something good. And therefore, you need to create a balance where you have the moral standing to say the government is doing good in this area, and therefore let me compliment them for the good work they are doing. But at the same time, you have a fundamental responsibility of demanding for accountability, because that is your role. It is also been increasingly realized that governance is not the sole responsibility of the government. I've seen in many African countries, especially those of us who work in civil society, we are on the other side of the fence. We don't want to be part of the solution. It is not all the time to criticize or to demand for accountability. You also have a fundamental responsibility to provide solutions, because you have the expertise and the capacity to do so. Hence, the promotion of good governance, civil society can play an important role in reforming the state in the badly governed countries. And through interrogation and collaboration, civil society can help to promote democracy, rule of law, and social justice. Let me also premise on the fact that the African Union recognizes the fundamental role of civil society. In fact, when you look at the vision of the African Union, a people-centered and a people-driven African Union, which simply means that people have to be at the center of their development. We have moved from the days where we have an African Union where the leaders will decide the development trajectory of a country. We are now living in an era after 2002 where the OAU transitioned to what we call the AU during the Durban Summit to give the mandate to the African people to take leadership and ownership of their development, to ensure that we have a bottom-up approach, to ensure that development is inclusive and it is driven by the African citizens themselves. So the AU recognized that in the Constitutive Act, Article 5 and 22, which talks about popular participation, gives mandate to the African citizens. And that is the reason why the African Union established an organ of the African Union, which is like a parliament of civil society, that is responsible to not only support in promoting the agenda and popularization of African Union programs and policy, but it also has a mandate to provide advisory opinion. We simply mean they recognize the fact that civil society has the capacity, and therefore when you identify a gap, in order for us to take corrective measures in addressing that gap, you have a fundamental role to play as civil society organization in providing or providing solutions to those problems. The African Union also recognized civil society in our AGA platform, what we call the African Governance Architecture and the African Peace and Security Architecture. These are all platforms that provide space for civil society to discuss issues of democratization, issues of peace, security, and stability, issues of social justice, rule of law, human rights, and the likes. So these are all areas that you can work on. Civil society can further good governance. One, by policy analysis and advocacy. Two, through regulation and monitoring of state performance and action and behavior of public officials. Three, building social capital and enabling citizens to identify and articulate their values, beliefs, and civic norms. It is important that we are having this conversation, and I'm very happy when the minister is saying this is an inclusive process. It is not a process where it is only discussed at cabinet level and decisions are taken as a result of a paper that has been written. It is a process that has been brought down so that you're able to have an interactive, a participatory process, so that at the end of the day, the decision can be owned by all of you. Public participation in influencing decision making, transparency and accountability are the hallmark of good governance. And the role of civil society in this regard is very, very important. I want to look at how civil society can help in establishing accountability in relation to what I have been asked to do here. And then I will conclude by looking at avenues for CSOs to promote good governance in Africa. One, Civil society or civil institution can be in totality referred to as voluntary, civic, and social organizations or institutions which form the basis of a functioning society as opposed to the force-backed structure of a state, regardless of that state or the political system therein. So another aspect that you need to take into consideration is the continuous checks of citizens which can help in establishing accountability, which says all of us have a role to play in contributing to good governance, in ensuring that we have a state that is working in the best interest to serve our own interests as citizens of the state. Citizen-centered collaborative public management. Whatsoever you are doing has to be centered around citizens. Citizens have to be the point of contact. They need to be at the center of development. Monitoring government performances, ensuring they deliver on their promises. It's important for you to take note of that. Reporting findings to a wider audience. I have seen people look at things going wrong and they say this is not part, I'm not part and parcel of it. For your information, I'm also a Sierra Leonean, and all the time I try to criticize when I see things that are not going on right. And I'm always accused it's because he has been out of the country for so long. But that is not the mindset. If it is wrong, it is wrong. And until all of us play that fundamental role to get it right, that is the time we will be able to move forward. Advocating for policy change. These are all roles of civil society. And you all have been playing it. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to stop and everything has to fix. I mean, to be at a point where everything has been addressed. Like the minister rightly said, we live in a contemporary society. The dynamic nature of things, the emerging trend, will definitely require us to continually reforming and changing things so that we're able to adapt to the dynamic change of things. So as I conclude in that direction, I want to look at the avenues where civil society can play a critical role in promoting good governance in Africa. And I'll look at four of them, and I'll talk about them briefly, and then I'll conclude. One is advancement in technology, and I think the minister talked about it briefly. Two is collaborative partnership with government and other stakeholders, building constructive working relationship with government. Civil society is not enemy of the state. Civil society should not be an opposition to government. Civil society should not be that entity that knows it all and they see themselves as if they are on the other side of the fence. Civil society is part and parcel of government, of the society. And then even those that are in government, they are also part and parcel of society. Increase public awareness and participation, which you have been doing. And lastly, strengthening legal and regulatory framework. It is important. Let me explain them briefly and then I'll conclude. On advancement in technology, I want to look at some area. One is civic engagement. Technology, as you all know, can enable civil society organizations to engage citizens and increase their participation in good governance processes. For instance, we have seen the role of social media, such as Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp. They have been used to organize campaigns. They have been used to mobilize citizens. They have been used to raise awareness about key governance issues. But at the same time, they have also been used for the wrong agenda. And we have seen it in many parts of our African member states, where we leverage on this opportunity, misinformation and disinformation, sending wrong signal, which has led to instability. But these are areas which civil society can utilize in the best interest of contributing to good governance and promotion of democracy in any given member state. Two, data collection and analysis. Technology can also be used to collect and analyze data related to governance. This can help civil society organizations to monitor government activities, track progresses, identify areas that require improvement. For example, the mobile phone-based surveys
and data visualization tools can be used to collect and analyze data on public service delivery, perception for issues like corruption, and other governance-related issues. My brother from Rwanda was talking about the e-governance. Are you able to access services? It's a one-stop shop. So this can give you an indication of how technology can contribute into governance. And because you are using the e-governance, you limit the human interaction and you limit issues of corruption. You limit other issues of kickbacks and the like. It's very important. Transparency and accountability is another one. I don't want to labor much on it. You all are aware. Online advocacy and campaign. You all are aware of many online campaigns such as petitions that has been done virtually. And I have seen in many parts of our engagement, African member states, especially those living in the diaspora, will submit petitions in various embassies or UN offices across the globe to social media just to ensure that they are able to communicate their views and perception on how they can influence change. So overall, in terms of advancement of technology, it provides civil society organizations in Africa with a range of opportunities to promote good governance. And if you leverage on it, civil society organizations can then engage citizens to collect and analyze data, promote transparency and accountability, and launch online advocacy campaigns that can help to advance governance reform in our various member states. The second aspect is the collaborative partnership with government and other stakeholders. CSO can identify common goals with government and stakeholders, such as promoting transparency and accountability and citizens' participation in governance. This can help to build one, trust, and establish a shared vision for good governance. It is a common problem. How do we identify it as a problem collectively, and how do we engage in dialogue so that at the end of the day, we're able to build trust and understanding and identify areas of collaboration. And more importantly, you have the expertise and the resources. And when I talk about resources, I'm not talking about financial resources. You have the technical capacity, which also comes as a resources. You can be able to help even in training government officials. We have seen institutions that are doing it, and you are also doing it. These are all ways and means you contribute into this process of revamping the public sector. And at the same time, you don't stop there. You monitor and evaluate so that at the end of the day, you're able to keep track of changes. Where there are gaps, you're able to identify those gaps, build gap reduction plan, and see how you can continually support government so that they're able to address those gaps. And you advocate for policy change. Because once you want to effect any particular change, it is through policy that you'll be able to effect those changes. So by developing a collaborative partnership with government and other stakeholders, civil society can play a critical role in promoting good governance in Africa. The third aspect, and I'm coming to my closure, is increased public awareness and participation. You are doing it, all of you. The people who are doing the biggest sensitization in the community, in our society, are civil society. Awareness raising campaign, civic education, information dissemination, community mobilization, and citizens reporting. These are all engagements that you are doing as civil society through your programmatic intervention, assisting and complementing the government at your community level, at the constituency level. Some of you have programs at national, subnational level, and at the grassroots level, empowering the community to be able to make informed decisions. So by increased public awareness and participation, civil society can help ensure that citizens are engaged in good governance processes and that their voices are heard. This can lead to a more accountable, transparent, and effective governance in Africa. And lastly, on the 4 areas which I identified, strengthening legal and regulatory framework. One, advocacy for legal reforms. There are many human rights-based organizations that are looking at laws that are archaic, laws that are primitive, laws that are not conform to our current day contemporary trend. And therefore you need to review those laws. And we have seen the role of civil society. Civil society has also played a critical role in providing legal aid and legal assistance so that you empower citizens, especially where they have expressed dissatisfaction and then maybe governments have taken an action which you don't think is in line with the Constitution. It is part of your mandate to keep government accountable. Monitoring and reporting and public interest litigation. These are also important aspects of civil society. Capacity building. We have seen it, that you have been doing it. So by strengthening legal and regulatory framework, civil society can help promote good governance in Africa, ensure that citizens' rights are protected. This can lead to a more transparent, accountable, and effective governance system that benefits everyone. In conclusion, African Union, ECOSOC, as one of the organs of the African Union, has been working with APRM. And when you look at the APRM 2020-2024 strategic plan, they prioritize civil society participation and engagement as a critical success factor. And that is the reason why when APRM is here, they are not only discussing with government, they are also discussing with other sectors of which the civil society happen to be one of. And therefore, it is important that we all have a role to play. And until we take leadership and ownership of what is required of us, that is the only time we will have a society that is reflective of what we aspire and what we want and the kind of change that we want to see. And that is the only time when Sierra Leone will be right up there. Because if Sierra Leone is taking the wrong path, it is not only the government. We all are Sierra Leoneans, and therefore, all of us will be blamed one day. Let's play our part as civil society, and let's continue to advocate. Let's continue with the struggle. Indeed, we have a role to play. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for that exhaustive discourse on the role of civil service organizations. I think he has very well noted that the civil service organization, the CSOs, are an instrumental partner in government, and they can be able to provide capacity building. I think that is one of the areas that we've been also talking about. That they have significant expertise, they have significant, extensive research and knowledge which they can be able to share with government. So the inclusion of CSOs within the governance architecture can be instrumental in government practice. So we've also seen how CSO can be able to establish accountability through the citizen-centric approach, monitoring government performance and reporting findings. I think most of the CSOs are academics and research institutions that we all refer to in terms of getting our research. And that is an avenue for promoting good governance. And then, of course, strengthening the legal framework and regulatory framework. So I thank you, sir, for that presentation. And without much further ado, allow me to present the next presenter, Mr. Andrew Lavelle, Director for the Institute of Governance Reforms, to make his presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. So we in the civil society world sometimes we fail to understand what protocols are. So excuse me if I don't, but let us just observe existing protocols as we go through the next 10 minutes to talk to give a brief contribution. I think I see this as an ambush because now I understand why some people say we have to repeat what the next speaker just said. So when you are talking, I was just reorganizing my notes, and forgive me if I did not, if I repeat what the gentleman just said. But let us start by doing the usual thing. Normally,
we see civil society and state relationship as a terrain of contestation. And I think the gentleman really emphasized that. We see it as a terrain of contestation between the state and citizens. And I think he rightly defined what many people see as civil society to be not only a watchdog, but to be a lapdog. And I want to believe in my 10th minute, maybe you will see a different definition of civil society. But there are what we call gap fillers. There are people that support the digging of boreholes, many NGOs. We saw people supporting even legal reforms. But there are people they call in Sierra Leone gongos, that are government NGOs. And there are people they call institutions, they call ONGOs, these are opposition NGOs. But there are organizations that attack the underlying causes of poverty and bring those issues to the fore. So I think it's good we have those 4 typologies in mind as we go through the presentation. But what is useful, it's good for, I see quite a lot of participants here from other African countries, but it is good for us to understand the terrain in Sierra Leone, the governance terrain in Sierra Leone, where civil society work. Together with the University of Chicago, we just completed a piece of research on chieftaincy and development. There is this belief, when you look at the map of Sierra Leone, it's almost like round in shape. On the northern hemisphere of that circle, you can see all painted red. That is where the opposition is predominant, the APC where they come from. On the bottom part of that circle, you can see all green, where the ruling party comes from. And there is this belief that if you are in the green part, your party needs to come to power, SLPP needs to come to power before you're better off. And there is this belief if you're in the red part, the APC needs to come to power before you are better off. And these views do not only shape politics, they shape civil society engagement, they shape media engagement, they shape the terrain in which we work. But we have noticed in that piece of research, and I'll just share that in a minute, that it has not worked for anyone in Sierra Leone for the past 62 years of independence. What it has generated is dependency and poverty. If you go to Makeni, you can see massive poverty. If you go to Bo, you can see massive poverty. So when you look at chiefdoms, where chiefdoms that have no representation, we actually took representations and development. Chiefdoms that have no representation are better off than chiefdoms with representation. By representation, I mean people that are top civil servants, people that are ministers that come from certain chiefdoms. So the graph that we showed was a continuum like this, where chiefdoms with zero appointment are better off because they are left to their own devices. And chiefdoms with 1 or 2 appointments are worse off. But don't get me wrong, chiefdoms with more appointments, such as Bambalis Jebora, Kakwa, are better off than chiefdoms with 0 appointments. And why is this important? It's important because civil society actually means going across multiple registers of citizenship, going across the vertical polarities and working across those polarities. That it means people from Makeni and people from Bo seeing the provision of electricity to be the same value, public goods to be the same. So we have this silo approach of civil society engagement where people say, I will keep quiet because my party is in power, or I'll shout the loudest, even about things that are not true. So, but in the area of accountability, it's useful to note that there's a demand side and the supply side. So I was speaking to some judges who were saying, people talk quite a lot about judicial accountability, and they fail to realize that judges are under pressure to do the wrong thing. So he said to us, in civil society, you have to prepare the demand side, because police actually do not take bribe, people pay bribe to them. So if we all stop paying bribes, there will be no bribery, the police will not take bribes. So we want to see how, when you talk about accountability, we look at both the demand side and the supply side. So here are some of the strategies, which I think is the core of the subject. The strategy that we have implemented over time is what we call social accountability. Social accountability is one approach we use to manage expectations. And why is social accountability important in contexts such as ours? The state is weak, the state is poor. The more you raise accountability, the more you raise expectations from the demand side, the weaker the state becomes if that state cannot deliver that expectation. And you push the country to chaos. In fact, there are certain times when I see some advocacy initiative by some of our colleagues, say this has the potential to plunge Sierra Leone back into chaos. So social accountability is an approach where the state and citizens, in the form of citizens group, civil society groups, come together to co-create solutions. So for example, government has created what they call the Big Five. We all need agriculture, we all need jobs. How are civil society and institutions coming together to co-create jobs, to co-create solutions in energy? So I think that approach has worked and it has helped very well. And as a testament to that, the gentleman spoke extensively about the use of data. We have been utilizing data quite a lot, and we produce what we call, in the area of health and education campaigns, for example, we produce what we call the Service Delivery Index. That was the first report that actually looked at provision of health and education services in MP constituencies and local councils. And why did we do that? Because health and education, important as they are not seen as vote winners. But they are the core of what we actually need to build human capital. So, but normally when MPs go to their constituencies, what people request are not public goods or private goods. I want to initiate my kids in secret society. I need you to support me. My mother died yesterday. Can you give me? I think this is not just unique to Sierra Leone, but it's common in many other African countries. But we had wanted to situate the conversation on health and education in communities, so we developed the Service Delivery Index. Because of the approach, the social accountability approach that was framed in what we call the Compact on Service Delivery, first the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education had to agree with us on what should be the indicators to monitor. 8 indicators in education, 6 indicators in health. And those indicators are linked with their ministerial performance benchmark. So then we realize that we are aligning incentives because the minister wants to succeed and we want to see service delivery improve. So because of that, the ministry has to validate the data, and they co-authored the forward of that report. And the report, it landed in Parliament. It was really interesting the way the report landed in Parliament. Within Parliament, the MPs, well, at that time, a lot of them do not want to hear the word civil society. But we do what we call framing of incentives. So the incentive was, members of Parliament want to stay in power. Citizens, we want services. So we said to them, there's a convergence of interest. If you champion service delivery, you will stay in power because you will increase your desirability. So that was the first report that was actually debated in Parliament by both sides of the well. It took about 2 hours of Parliament to endorse the service delivery index. So there are opportunities, and it's just possible for civil society and the states to work together to advance progress. There is automation. So automation is not just on e-governance, but civil society, we are investing quite a lot now in automation. And I want to encourage colleagues here that automation is one of the biggest tools that we use these days. Just 2 years ago, a year ago precisely, we collated all of the audit recommendations over the last 6 years. 2,556 recommendations. And then we went through scrupulous which recommendations have been implemented, which ones have not been implemented. It turned out that only 33% of recommendations have been implemented. And then we said we need to automate those recommendations. Now those recommendations have been automated. We now have an online scorecard or platform where permanent secretaries will actually see recommendations that have been implemented and what are the progress or the lack thereof on the tracker. So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because government openness helps civil society. Government openness, it makes the society to bring on board the existing reserve of energy. You cannot solve education problem if civil society is not with you to monitor schools in the form of school management committees, health management committees. Government and civil society have to co-create. I would like to end up with, I'm heading for a press conference just after here. We're launching a report that we call Tragedies of Politics. And so we just looked at state-owned enterprises, and it's really interesting. Looking at state-owned enterprises over the last 20 years, I was listening to Mr. Kilba talking about the role of the private sector, which is very important. We realize that state-owned enterprises are really failing. Yet we still pay them hefty salaries. So we present in that report or that documentary to the Ministry of Development. Ministry of Development, I just wish they're here. In our next planning, we would like to see a portion of the plan be financed by our state-owned enterprises. It is not enough for us to say we are going to develop our plans and wait for IMF and the World Bank to finance our plans while our enterprises that receive our taxpayers' money fail us. So civil society, we have quite a lot to bring on the table, and I hope, I'm happy that the African Union, the APRN is creating this opportunity, and I only believe and I hope that these platforms get bigger. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for that presentation. Reiterating the role of CSO in terms of research and knowledge development, we look forward to maybe reading that report that you shall be launching. I'm sure it will add a voice to this topic. So he's also mentioned social accountability and advocacy and co-creation, how the CSOs can work with government in terms of co-creation of research, in terms of co-creation of employment, in terms of co-creation of giving citizens a voice. I think some CSOs are very strong in the local level, and for them, the citizens can be able to approach them. I think for us in our country, Kenya, the legal assistance that is provided by the CSO is something that has been noted, especially at the local level. So it is indeed the CSO's participation and them supporting government efforts that is taken note of in this session. So we'll move on to the third presenter, Mr. Charles Lahai from the Independent Commission for Peace and National Coherence, for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and kindly permit me to acknowledge the protocols that has already been established. And like Andrew said, when you speak last, you're almost tempted to say that earlier speakers have said what I wanted to say. But I will try to maybe swing in between what my two colleagues have said. And let me also use this opportunity to thank the Africa Peer Review Mechanism and the Ministry of Political and Public Administration for organizing this event. I'm also proud to note that I participated in the APRM targeted review on Sierra Leone, focusing on health governance and COVID-19 response. And while I was serving in the NGC. And when I say NGC, I mean the National Governing Council, not the NGC that we know. I participated as a civil society representative. And so, 20 years before 2021, I was a member of civil society. And we used to call ourselves a civil society family. And today, given that we have now known the dichotomy between civil servant and public servant, I now here stand today as a public servant. And so I do recognize my colleagues, civil society representatives in the hall. And I also want to recognize the presence of my board member, Paramount Chief Fasuluku. So today we're talking about accountability, core strategies, and best practices, the role of civil society organizations in holding governments accountable, practices for enhanced accountability in Africa. And we're talking about the Africa that we want. What can civil society do to ensure that we see the Africa that we want to see in the next 5, 10, 15, and 20 years or more? What are the indicators that will show us that we are moving towards that? So, it is often assumed that vibrant civil society is precondition for democracy, for government accountability, and for rule of law. So following this assumption, it is important that civil society organizations participate in activities that promote social accountability, like Andrew said. And when I talk about social accountability, I will move slightly beyond what he said and look at social accountability of governments towards societies. And in this regard, I think it is compelling that civil society organizations follow policy and not politics. What I mean here is that CSOs must follow the depoliticized approach, but also should nurture relationships with state institutions and cooperate with public officials in the quest to hold governments accountable. And only in this way will that provide a potential for civil society organizations to contest power of the state and thus contribute to strengthening government accountability and the rule of law. So because accountability is often used interchangeably with good governance, civil society, rule of law, and government accountability are concepts often associated with traditions of politics and law. There is therefore a seeming widespread understanding of civil society government accountability nexus that emphasizes the important role of civil society in fostering democracy, rule of law, and good governance. But let me say this, that when we talk about civil society and their role in holding governments accountable, the first question that comes to mind is, how satisfied are we with the way accountability works in Africa? How can civil society organizations position themselves to hold government accountable? So the role of CSOs in holding government accountable presupposes that the concepts of rule of law and government accountability rest on the balance of powers and plurality of societal interests of various social groups and actors. These social interests, groups, and specific cross-group alliances are fundamental elements that can sustain the rule of law and also ensure that they are operational. Therefore, in analyzing the role of CSOs in holding governments accountable, it is important to also assess CSOs' ability to challenge the African power structures, and I want to use this opportunity to refer to what my colleague talked about when he referred to the African governance architecture. And I want to look at the charter, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, and how that charter uses the African governance architecture as a framework to implement the charter. So a deeper understanding of the African governance framework will enable and ensure that civil society organizations and their platforms have greater capacity to plan and coordinate stronger advocacy on the structure and functions of the African governance architecture. So accountability and good governance in Africa will require a robust civil society action. And to ensure that CSOs are best positioned to implement such action and monitor best practices for enhanced accountability in Africa, I would say that civil society must have the capacity to do so. Such capacity might swing between adaptive capacity, the capacity to manage, technical capacity, institutional capacity, etc., that can be used to enhance and coordinate advocacy and campaign responses at the national, the regional, and the continental levels. Through a comprehensive program of capacity building, CSOs will gain an understanding of the African governance architecture, but firstly, the Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, and the skills in planning, in strategizing, in coordinating, and in networking, and also using the media as a tool for advocacy that will enable them to engage effectively in a coordinated approach in driving advocacy as a tool to implement policies and programs with their national governments. Activities that also foster horizontal and vertical linkages between CSOs in Africa can be of greater importance in order to widen the geographical scope of CSOs' interventions. So joint advocacy plans and actions will also be an output of a very good planned and coordinated approach. Accountability in its truest sense, in the context in which we are holding this discourse, is a relationship between an actor, which could be the government, or African governments, and a forum, which could be the civil society organizations, in which the actor has an obligation to explain and to justify his or her conduct, and the forum can pose questions and pass judgment. And in most cases, the actors are bound to face consequences. Therefore, the role of CSOs to promote social accountability in governance and hold governments accountable is crucial in implementing the ACDEG, that is the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, and the tool or the framework, which is the African governance architecture. The other means by which CSOs can participate or can hold their governments responsible is, first of all, ensuring that the CSOs themselves understand the government policies. When they understand the government policies, they stand in a better position to be able to define the governance architecture and also identify linkages with other CSOs and their initiatives. CSOs can gather evidences through what my colleague talked about, the citizens report methodology, in order to promote evidence-based advocacy. And when I say evidence-based advocacy, I refer to advocacies based on data and information, as well as designing and facilitating service scorecards. It is important to note that there is a growing recognition that policy making should be anchored in evidence, and thus evidence gathering to support a call for change has become part of best practices for CSOs. CSOs can also hold interface meetings with government. They could hold CSO government dialogue forums, And it is important to note that the main vehicle for advancing accountability and community or service scorecards processes is an interface meeting. This is where citizens or community members and government representatives can get together to compare scores, to identify problems, and to decide how to overcome those problems. So community interface meetings can be followed by probably different fora where community representatives and service providers meet with different officials and politicians to discuss high-level systemic problems and solutions. The evidence presented at interface meetings could embarrass public officials. Hence, it is important to consider the risks and consequences of this beforehand. Community members might also plan in advance how they will respond if officials become defensive or threatening. So the aim is basically not to back down, but to focus on achieving the desired change through processes. And when my colleague talked about having an empowered society, having an empowered citizenry, it is also the responsibility of civil society to ensure that we have an informed and an empowered citizenry. And when I say an empowered citizenry, I normally like to refer to what the Commonwealth refers to when they talk about empowerment. And it states that empowerment relates to civil society organizations or individuals who can think for themselves, who can also think by themselves, who can make informed decisions, who can take actions, but in the end they can be able to take responsibility for the cause of their actions. So in this way, civil society could strategize advocacies and plan initiatives in relation to the African governance architecture and link them across levels. They could also promote effective collaboration and to also engage strategically in planning and establishing networks and platforms to further their engagement. It is also the role of civil society to demand for information, not out of malice, but as a means to assess needs with a view to advocating for improved current efforts as well as identifying gaps. Civil society should also be able to measure risks and opportunities while serving as pressure groups and whistleblowers by drawing citizens' attention to critical issues of interest. And one of the commendations I would like to give to civil society is the fact that most civil society are now using advocacy as a means of preventing unrest or conflict. Civil society would also do what is called a stakeholder and power analysis, where they objectively look at the types and forms of power and that stakeholders hold and how they influence the agenda of implementation of government policies and programs. And it's not only about stakeholder analysis, but we also look at what we call duty bearers, those individuals and those institutions that are mandated by law to provide certain services to the people. Civil society also holds the role or responsibility of setting the objectives, where they will reflect on the current context and look at the resources that are available within their confines and what could be achieved using that objective for advocacy efforts. In order to hold governments responsible in Africa, civil society could also engage in events making. That is focusing on the activities that they could plan to challenge the power of stakeholders who might be creating barriers to realize the objectives. Mobilization and engagement is also very key, where they could strategize on how to engage and mobilize each of the stakeholders, and they look at the advocacy measures by way of looking at what messages can they give to engage and how to engage both face-to-face and through digital means. The third to the final point I would want to talk about is using the public action learning as a way of holding governments accountable. Public perception data about the performance of governments with regards to the established principles provides an opportunity to practice and generate learning from the experience of implementing those learnings in public. The development also of a participatory monitoring framework, my colleagues talked about that is structured according to the commitments of governments to monitor the way in which those commitments are implemented at national, regional, and continental levels could be one way that civil society could use to monitor accountability of government. In conclusion, I would want to emphasize that CSOs must uphold ethical values in order to effect the African Union and the Assembly's decision on the establishment of the Pan-African governance architecture, the African Union Commission, the established African governance architecture as a platform for dialogue between the various stakeholders who are mandated to promote and to strengthen democratic governance in Africa, in addition to translating the objectives of the legal and policy pronouncements in the AU shared values. I want to thank you very much, and I want to thank my colleague civil society organizations in Sierra Leone, and I hope that we would use this platform or this discourse, the outcomes of this discourse, to engage further with other civil societies. I am aware that when civil society challenge African governments, you are looked upon as troublemakers. And so where there is need to replace you, they can replace you with subservient ones. But let me say that we have a unique opportunity to look at the role of civil society and to see how civil society could interface with government to ensure that the development programs and policies are implemented at all levels. I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, sir, for that presentation and giving the dual responsibility of the CSO in terms of empowering the citizens, and then also on the government side in terms of lobbying and providing advocacy for policy change. So I think that presentation marks the end of the session today. So at this stage, I would like to open up the floor to questions on this topic. How can CSOs also provide, how can they also be held to account so that they're not used as vehicles for politicizing matters, but for policy change? How then can we do that? So at this point, I'd like to invite and welcome questions from the audience. Yes, Madam over there. We'll take a round and then we'll have the panelists respond to them. So let's have a few more from the CSOs in the house also. Let's hear what your take is. Over there also.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'm so delighted to see our agenda represented there. My name is Dr. Leone Kamabose, panel lead for Sierra Leone. My question is related to, I think now you call them civil society, funding. I am a second generation, what we call now civil society. My mother was a community leader and very active in what those days we used to call voluntary organization. And in my earlier life, I did a lot of voluntary organization, particularly early childhood care, stimulation, and education, which has taken almost 60 years to be recognized. We were not paid, we worked, we lobbied. So after about close to 60 years from voluntary organization to civil society, I want to find out most of the civil society are funded externally. Are there any civil society in our continent that have worked out methods of raising their own funds after 40 or 50 years? Or the majority or all of them are externally funded, which is okay? but for the Africa we want, I think we want to move to where we can fund ourselves so that all our ideas and plans and future, what word shall I use, are carried forth. Because some of this funding, you know what happens, it has restrictions, it comes with some ideas, and you have to finish in 3 years or in 2 years, and when the money dries up, you stop and your office is closed. I hope my question is clear. Thank you very much, Madam Director.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. My name is William Saul Amin, Executive Director for Accountability Now Sierra Leone Civil Society. And I also want to say thanks to the presenters. You will agree with me that MDAs that has been willing to work with civil society have been making a lot of impact. But some of those who believe that we are evil society, I will tell you for free, they have not been able to make any progress within their MDAs. As civil society, I think we've been there to complement the efforts of the government, giving support to government. And I believe working with government is not like you are working for government. When you are working with and you are working for, it's two different things. But sometimes people believe when you are working with government, they think you are actually working for that government. And I believe one of the speakers rightly said that nothing is wrong for us to work with government institutions, because even our national constitution, there is provision for civil society that are actually called non-state actors to work with government institutions. And I will tell you for free, some of us have worked in that direction for several years now. For example, when you talk about the free healthcare that was launched by the previous government, some of us were all over the place because there was some amount of confusion, in fact. Where should I access the free healthcare? Who are these beneficiaries of the free healthcare? Some people are going to private hospitals where they cannot have free healthcare. So we are there to educate them, to know exactly that an old man is not part of this package, but we have the three category of people: the lactating mothers, the children under 5, and the pregnant women. So we are there filling the gap, because we know there are some remote communities. You go, you don't see government officials in that particular community. But when you get there, you see the CDOs who can support the government by disseminating information, by educating the people for them to actually know what is happening at national level. So we've been playing a lot of, our own part in terms of elections and so many other areas. So civil society, we are still there. Even today we are here because the Minister for the Public Administration and Political Affairs has thought it wise that civil society is going to play a pivotal role, and this is not a one-off game. It's going to be ongoing process. And we assure the panelists that we, civil society, are ready to work with any government and we are ready to complement their efforts. So I want to thank you very much. It's not about question, but just making a comment. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Patrick Kawa. I am from the civil service. I want to just add my voice to this discourse, particularly in relation to the presentations made by our colleagues there on the high table. I want to specifically refer to the acknowledgement of one of the presenters that the civil service appears to be pluralized, given the fact that the analogy he gave, where you have the Ongos, or, how do you call the other one? Those that are opposition and civil societies, and those that are perceived to be the government civil societies. I mean, this has been something that has been, to me, kind of undermining the operations and credibility of the civil society organizations. So coming from you as an operative, it's an indication that you recognize it. So I just want to ask you kindly how you can work, or how are the strategies that you can put in place. Now we are here talking about the multi-holder and stakeholder discussions. Clearly these are issues that government also is concerned about. So what are the strategies you put in place to close or to at least minimize some of these things? Because at the end of the day, it's about the people of this country. It's about bringing up objective views where government cannot do things. But if you are perceived to be doing something with a political lens, or trying to kind of support a particular political organization, your job, even how genuine it might be, will not be taken kindly. So I think you are aware of that, and it's really affecting the good job you are supposed to do. So what strategies can you put in place in the first place to close that gap? The other one also is about the very important topic we are talking about, the accountability. Again, it's interesting because it's like the chicken and the egg thing. I remember some time ago when the Minister of Planning was trying to develop a document that was all over the place. The government was accusing the civil society organizations as not working, not declaring what they have in terms of their finances. Government do not know about it. And they were also accusing government of closing the space. Government also was saying, oh, you are also closing the space on me, because the monies you receive on behalf of the people is a public money. We should know about it and all of these things. So it's about issue of accountability. It's not only on the part of government, but also on the part of the civil society as well. So it's just a general comment again. How do we work together? Because it's all about providing services for the people of this country, making the lives of the people of Sierra Leone better. So in terms of accountability, how do we close this together? How do we work together so that the people know that even though we are providing services, you listening to our lady there, Yabon Pose, talking about that, we know you go out there, get monies on behalf of the people of this country. So we need to know as well. So accountability is so important that we are here discussing it today. So I want to thank you so much.
One last one there.
Thank you so much. I raised my hand and my colleague there took my questions from my mind, but I still had to speak so people here cannot think that I cannot talk. So I still talk. That would be important for me to talk. But I really want to hammer home this accountability issue. And since he has said a lot on it, I just want to conclude by saying, if you want to not appear as a lapdog, don't appear to be don't be perceived to be corrupt. Because if you appear or you are perceived to be corrupt, it becomes difficult to be trusted as a civil society institution. So I just want to throw that in, but notwithstanding, I concur with him. We want you to just walk us through as a network. What have you done as a strategy being produced so that you minimize that risk of perceiving to be corrupt or not to be corrupt, any way you take it?
Thank you for that. I think we have effectively handled all the raised hands. Yes. So at this point, I will give the microphone to the speakers who will now respond to the questions.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's only one question regarding funding. Indeed, like you rightly said, Madam, funding is a fundamental challenge across the board. Even governments are now having challenges in meeting the cost of their funding their budgets, and other institutions are also having issues with funding. And by nature of civil society and the kind of engagement that you embark on, the most appropriate channel that you've been using over the years is through the form of grant, proposal writings, and the likes. In the past, government used to give what they call subvention to civil society organizations, especially community-based kind of organization. But in our very complex and compounded nature of politics, if even government is to give any civil society, let's say some small funding, obviously it will be interpreted to mean something totally different. Not from the angle of civil society complementing government, but most likely becoming a mouthpiece of government. That would definitely be the kind of conclusion that you would have. But then, because of the dynamic nature which we are talking about, every institution, every sector required to reform and required to conform to the new dynamics. And therefore, civil society should start beginning to look at alternative sources of funding. Membership funds or contribution, developing programs for resource mobilization kind of activities and the likes. We have seen beyond grants and proposals, how do you work with philanthropist-based organizations? We have seen corporate social responsibility, and in fact, the second model, which I was talking about in the Trinity model, which is the private sector. We need to begin to interrogate how many of them are playing the corporate social responsibility, contributing to community. It is not only something which is meant for big institutions, because in countries like Sierra Leone, it is considered to be big institution. In fact, even big institution, you start asking yourself, what are the programs that they have that gear towards supporting the community in which they operate? So we need to begin to look at interrogating ways and means on how we can mobilize resources to meet the demands of our activity. And lastly, many organizations are now, civil society organizations, are transitioning to what they call think tank, which provides policy advice, policy recommendation, policy paper, and it can be paid for because it's an expertise that you are providing. So these are all sources or alternative avenues to mobilize resources within our current contemporary society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me bring in the concept of participation with regards to the role of civil society. Long before now, civil society organizations are moved by the way the funding stream is directed. So if you say, for example, a donor comes today and say, we have funding for organizations that are doing fishing projects. And you see all organizations who are even not part of that going there just because it's there. Okay? And so what happens is that it creates the space for unhealthy competition. And when government funds civil society, the element of participation comes in. Who participates? Who decides who participates? Who decides how they participate? Who decides for whom they participate? And who decides the level of their participation? So what happens in situations like that is that civil society is bound to fall into what I would call a political juncture trap. And so what's needed here is an expanded space for civil society. Now we know that civil societies are built on competencies and skills. You have, for example, the IGR, they are more focused on research. You have institutions that are focused on accountability. You have institutions that are focused on health, etc., etc. So once we do that, then we are creating a pool for competitiveness. And when that happens, we create the space for participation, we create the space for building partnerships, we create the space for strategic engagement, and we also create the space for policy analysis and policy advisory processes. So that is what I would say. But across the continent, I know that civil society organizations are doing their bits, but we must also ensure that they are familiar with government policies and they can work in partnership with government in implementing those policies and programs so that it becomes a people-centered business and not just a one-off thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. At the risk of repeating what colleagues have said, it's useful, just for me to start by sharing this data on localization. Less than 2% of aid actually comes through local structures. You're right about how is funding sought by civil society today. Some years ago, I could say decades ago, civil society used to have what they call core institutional funding. That really helped. It helped them to rent offices, pay staff, and people fail to realize even for you to go on radio, go on television, you actually pay fuel, you use fuel. So, but because the aid landscape, the aid portfolio has shrunk and is shrinking, the gentleman said we need to think about creative ways. Of course, there are creative ways, but one of the things we need to live with African civil society is this big push for localization. I understand the US is pushing towards 50% of aid from the US going towards local civil society, something by 2030. It's the route to sustainability, because the route to financing development does not only confer legitimacy, it confers capacity. There are many times when, if you go to local communities, they respect NGOs, international NGOs in the main, more than members of parliament. Say, because World Vision is buying books for my kids, my local councillor and my MPs giving me nothing. So we actually need to have a broader conversation on aid financing and localization. I take Saul Lamin's point on working with government and working for government, and that dovetails very well in the question around Gongo and Ongos, government NGOs and opposition NGOs. To me, both do not matter. What really matters is what are the results. Civil society, we need to measure ourselves by the results we create. So all the noise you cause, how is that translating into better health care? How is that translating into better education? So that's why when we push social accountability and co-creation of results, it's good for government and civil society, private sector and civil society to co-create results, to agree on what they want to co-create together. My last point on civil society accountability. So there are many facets to that. There is accountability to donors, there is accountability to citizens. But I think these questions really should go back to government. How are we coordinating? If we fail to coordinate, you definitely have civil society finance, maybe lining up people's pockets. But we're happy to see that a new NGO policy has been developed for Sierra Leone, and so it means we're going to have a new architecture for non-state actor coordination. So but I think coordination is key. You go to many local councils, district councils, you see NGOs doing their thing, and local councils don't even know what NGOs are doing. So I think if we do not push coordination, it's a problem. We know some CSOs that are even not accountable to their own networks. So, but when we have a state that coordinates, they will definitely be in position to rein NGOs in and demand for greater accountability for non-state actors. Thank you.
Thank Thank you so much for those responses. Please another round of applause for the speakers. At this juncture, again, I would like to thank all of you as being very, very interesting and engaging participants, and thank you for your participation. At this point, I'd like to return the program back to Dr. Gaima. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
A big thank you for our sister and to the team. Thank you very much for your time. And Mr. Lavalley, fare you well. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we had what was initially called breakfast. It's going close to lunch. In the spirit of accountability, because it was paid for, we have to have the service. So I will now encourage us all to spend the next 20 minutes, stretch out a little bit, a health break, and have tea or coffee and some snacks, and we'll come right back and speed up for closure. Thank you very much for your cooperation and support.